Hello and welcome to the Media Podcast. Think of us as your very own media club. I'm Matt Deegan, and on the show today, the Telegraph loses another prospective buyer as Lord Rothermere pulls the Daily Mail group out of the auction. 1 year in, are we any closer to the future of the newspaper group? Also on the programme, Ofcom strikes back at the BBC over their radio expansion plans. Boom Radio's Phil Riley gives us his reaction. All that plus, who are the other winners of this year's election? We discuss the BBC versus Channel 4 and its great times in digital news and podcasting. Plus, in the media quiz, we polish some TV turds. That's all to come in this edition of the Media Podcast. In the news this week, a deal has been struck between programme makers and the BBC as trade body Audio UK announced new terms of trade for the audio sector. The agreement increases the funding producers receive for production and opens up more opportunities to exploit their IP in foreign markets. Banijay's UK chief Patrick Holland has called on broadcasters to publish the money spent in each genre they commission in. Speaking to the Broadcasting Press Guild on Tuesday, he said that indies deserve to know what money was on the table if they were going to run their business effectively. Audiences across the country have been shocked by the 3 women killed on Wednesday, all of whom were the close family of BBC commentator John Hunt. Hunt is a horse racing commentator who has worked for 5 Live for many years. Our thoughts are with him and his family at this very difficult time. And Sun columnist Trevor Kavanagh has announced his retirement after over 40 years on the paper. During that time, he was their political editor, breaking stories into the Hutton inquiry, as well as an outspoken defender of journalists caught up in the phone hacking scandal. He told the press this week, "I am the same age as doddery American President Joe Biden. It's time both of us left the building." Well, with me in the London podcast studio, showing no signs of slowing down, we welcome back the Guardian's media news editor, Jim Waterson. Hello.
Hello.
So you've been on election duty recently. How was all of that?
Well, I've been the Guardian's media editor for a while, and I came back from parental leave and wanted a new challenge, and so I've been on the election team. And it was supposed to be 6 months, a nice long run into the autumn, covering the build up to a general election. And then the moment I was back in the door, Rishi Sunak called the election. But apart from my own angst over the timing of it, actually, I really enjoyed it. It was 6 weeks of trying to work out what people were seeing, whether it was influencing them, how people were actually consuming the media. And I'll be honest, it was kind of exhilarating and shocking at the same time.
Well, we had Mariana Spring on the show last week, who was covering some of the things that I saw you written about. And we sort of said it was sort of less nefarious than people expected, but more worrying from real humans.
I actually came away from it thinking that the most interesting thing was people were getting the information that they wanted and were being able to make decisions based on that. There wasn't a wild amount of disinformation. And the fact that maybe people were consuming less mainstream news, strangely, they seemed to know about the stuff they cared about. And there's a bit of hope there. I'm not sure it's necessarily hope if you work in the journalism industry. Some of the people I talked to, some of the things we picked up on while doing bits of research were quite worrying in terms of people consuming absolutely nothing recognizable as mainstream news. But that didn't mean that they were actually not able to exercise their civic duty and vote in a way that was fairly well informed. So there's things for us all to learn in terms of, if you want to make your journalism relevant to the audiences nowadays, there's some brilliant research that was done by a company called Revealing Reality for us, where we just went and recorded the screens of a load of people. Mariana took one approach where they sort of came up with artificial people.
Yes.
And this one was a bit more, can we just look over your shoulder for a few days and see what's actually on your screen? And that was sort of more bizarre in some ways, because you saw the complete chaos. It wasn't, if we try and do this in a scientific way, it was, let's just at random choose some people, and you had a person who hadn't even heard that there was a conflict in Palestine until 6 months ago, who then entirely their feed was about Gaza, and they were changing their vote on that basis. You had a teenager who basically only knew Nigel Farage as a meme on from Cameo comments.
Maybe not a terrible way to consume him.
But all of these people had things that mattered to them, and they were just, whether it was through things being forwarded on WhatsApp or finding things on TikTok, or even, God forbid, a few of them consuming BBC News and other mainstream outlets. They were finding out about stuff. They just often were tuning out the noise around it, which actually maybe isn't the worst outcome, even if some of us, make a living off providing that noise.
Next to Jim, we have Endelman's UK Senior Head of Strategy, Karin Robinson. Hello.
Hello.
Have you been following Biden-gate?
All too well, unfortunately, because I had to comment on it for Times Radio the morning after, which meant waking up at about 6 a.m. to watch 90 minutes of what was, frankly, some of the worst television I have ever seen.
Yes.
So that was a morning I wish I could have back, but here we are.
So you had a podcast talked about democratic politics, big sort of Democrat in the UK. All the things I'm reading, people are quite split. He's achieved a huge amount as a president in his first term. Is he going to make it through next week? Is he going to be their nominee?
So if I could be really clear that I'm speaking now as Karin Robinson, private individual, and not as a representative of the Democratic Party in any way, shape or form, I think the summary of how Democrats in general are feeling about Biden, although, as you say, there is a split in terms of how that's coming out, is we generally like his performance as a president, and we're generally very concerned about his performance as candidate. Yeah. And I think what you're seeing a lot of the time is people who are focused on his successful performance as president, wanting to lean into that, but also perhaps coming from a place of that the idea that changing candidates is going to be a chaos-free, easy ride into the White House seems a little naive. And then on the other hand, you have the fact that he is an 81-year-old man who is, I think, mentally still quite fit, but physically very frail, who has always had a stammer and a difficulty kind of getting words out, which is only getting worse as he ages. And the bottom line is he's not going to magically get younger between now and November. So
in a week's time, will he still be the nominee?
In a week's time, yes.
Okay.
But ask me about a month's time and I'm not so sure.
Jim, it's interesting. The New York Times has really sort of gone for Biden. There's been a lot of feedback about how they've reacted to him compared to, say, talking about Donald Trump. Is it just the messenger gets nailed?
The American liberal obsession with the New York Times and what it covers, it's basically the same as over here with the BBC with certain factions, except the BBC seems to get it from all sides. I think it's been fascinating. It's also been interesting to watch the emerta break and everyone overcorrect that, something that was basically a crank right-wing conspiracy theory to point out that this guy seems a bit older than he used to. This happens. Has suddenly become a sort of statement of serious journalistic, investigation. And the Wall Street Journal under Emma Tucker, a British editor, went there a few months earlier and got a lot of flack for it.
And a lot of Post-it notes.
And that was because she decided to go and sack everyone in the same way that British editors are known for doing. But they went there on Biden's age and his ability to do the job a few months ago and got a lot of pushback then. I'm interested to see over here in the UK as well what happens to a lot of the news outlets and the sort of influencers who sprung up over Brexit and opposing the Tories, what they do now Labour's in power. Because there's sort of an audience that was all about get the Tories out. And how they splinter is going to be interesting because, when politics becomes fandom, odd things happen.
Yeah. I think that's a problem that the American media has. I don't think the American media is fundamentally rooting against Joe Biden, but I think they are... it's a better and more interesting story because they've covered the Trump story for years now. And although I think the general public is not aware of some of the more recent things that he's been saying and doing that are on the more extreme end of a push towards authoritarianism, the media have covered it so often that they no longer think it's an interesting story. Whereas especially disarray among Democrats is something quite new. We have been pretty unified as a party and now we're sort of falling to pieces, let's be honest. So I don't blame the New York Times or other media outlets from going, this is an interesting story. But fundamentally, the story breaks down to time exists.
Yes. Well, speaking of mainstream media, DMGT, which owns the Daily Mail, has pulled out of the auction to buy the Telegraph Group. This is according to the Times. I mean, this story has rumbled on and on and on. Why are DMG out of the running?
Well, they say that the reason is this bill, this amendment to the Digital Market Competition Act that was passed earlier this year, which was done specifically to stop one takeover of the Telegraph back with foreign money, which is now making every other company that wants to take it over realize that they're pretty stuffed if they ever want to take foreign money, because often foreign money nowadays means Gulf money, it means Saudi, UAE, all of these states that are so full of cash but want somewhere to spend it and want to buy influence. And all these outlets that are thinking of bidding for the Telegraph are realizing we might get stuffed if we ever want to take even a few percent.
I mean, I was reading a bit about it, and it seems like I think it went through did it go through the wash-up or a bit before the wash-up, and it was somewhat rushed, even to the extent that something that, say, the Norwegian public fund invested in would be difficult to make a bid on any of these things.
Absolutely, and it wasn't intended to stop a sort of slightly passive owner like a Norwegian sort of wealth fund from their oil money. It was supposed to stop very specific people exercising control. And the interesting thing is that it certainly seems to be playing into the hands of Paul Marshall, the GB News major shareholder, who would be looking to buy the Telegraph because he doesn't have the need for money from a state. He's backed instead by US money and other sources that we'll find out in due course when it goes through the purchase process.
His lovely right-wing friends.
Exactly. But I mean, the really geeky thing that makes me laugh about all of this is it's all to stop takeovers of newspapers or news magazines. Yeah. And when I went back through the legislation, I was like, what is a newspaper in British law? Like, what is a newspaper? Because, I can't remember when I last read a print newspaper. And it turns out that is basically it. If it's a product printed, it's a newspaper. And if it's a news outlet with enormous reach, but online only, then it's not a newspaper, and there's no rules on who can take over and invest in it, which is very funny. So if the Telegraph shut down its print edition tomorrow, you could have the Gulf money back in.
But also, this is media's entwinement with politics, and this is about the Telegraph as well.
And the Conservative Party.
Yes, when the Conservative Party were in charge, and who they wanted or didn't want to own that title. Do you think part of the Daily Mail's view is also they don't want to get into a tangle with the Labour government?
Well, I think they've very explicitly said that in their statement, that they think this government would be very happy to go through this very closely, and there wouldn't be any sort of nod and a wink that you'll be all right with us if you want to buy this.
I sort of thought it was maybe maybe what Labour should have done is let the Far East or the Middle East buy the Telegraph, and then just let them deal with that situation. Maybe that would have been a positive thing from a political
But also,
standpoint.
what is the influence? And does the influence of right-wing papers when the Conservatives are out of power, is it the same? I mean, 10 years ago, I remember talking to people in Downing Street when I was a political reporter, and they'd be like, you cannot emphasise enough how much, if Paul Dacre puts something on the Daily Mail front page, that will dominate the morning planning meeting at Downing Street in terms of what we do for the rest of the day. It really does. This was sort of 2015 era. And a decade on, how long is that going to last, that these outlets, some of which have transferred online quite successfully, some of which have influence among a niche, but very few of which can claim to have truly mass readerships now? How long until, this government in particular, who has little really to owe some of these outlets, can just go, we don't really care so much about you?
Well, speaking about the government, we have another culture secretary, the 9th in 7 years. Lisa Nandy was appointed by Keir Starmer a week ago. So it was going to be Thangnam Debonair as the culture secretary. She didn't win her seat, so Lisa Nandy has stood in her place. What do we know about her?
Well, we know that she ran against Keir Starmer for the leadership. She's seen as on the soft left of the party. A former student journalist who decided politics was for her instead, and also the child of journalists as well, who grew up in Manchester. I'm not sure if she's from Wigan or from Manchester, but her mum worked, I think, for what the papers say in Granada. Basically,
Granada TV.
I think you could probably, if you were doing a portrait of her in Medialand, you'd do her as she's a Granada baby, basically. Okay. Which I think there is a thing, because that was when Granada in the 80s and 90s, before it got swallowed up into ITV, had its own distinctive identity. That base on the river newspaper in Manchester that really produced sort of things that were known nationwide.
A lot of current affairs journalism as well.
And a lot of current affairs journalism. I would assume that will influence some of her thinking in terms of, obviously, she's an MP for Wigan. She's talked immediately about inequality in the media and also regional inequality in the media and the need to support things across the country. But there's a lot of frantic Googling, Wikipedia, sort of reading the lines on her Wikipedia page. I always love it when someone unexpected gets appointed to the job, and you can tell that someone trying to be in the know is just regurgitating lines. It's like, I know that's from the sort of early career section on Wikipedia.
It's like, has she ever been to a classical music concert? What sport does she like? All of those things that culture secretaries face. Exactly.
So rugby league, I'm sure, will suddenly have a funding settlement like no other, given Wigan's background.
So, Karin, what's at the top of her inbox?
Lisa Nandy will be a very busy lady, because I think, fair to say, in the last few years of the Conservative government, a lot of the kind of major media questions have been unresolved. Most significant of which has been the debate around BBC licence fees and the kind of ongoing funding of BBC. There's still things to pick up around Channel 4 and what its future is going to look like. But I think there's probably quite a lot of other things as well on her agenda that she'll need to get to as and when. But I think what I find quite encouraging is that, she isn't somebody who's coming in without having thought about these issues. She's already thought and written quite a bit about the media. I think we can all be fairly encouraged that although she has a busy inbox, she's coming into it with some knowledge and some appreciation for the nuances. So, I'm looking forward to seeing what she does.
Something that the new government could change fast is the culture and media regulator Ofcom, which has faced calls to show more teeth. And so it was a surprise this week to hear that it had paused the launch of Radio 2's spin-off, one that bore a striking resemblance to Boom Radio. Well, with us on the line to discuss that news is Phil Riley, CEO of Boom Radio. Hello, Phil.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm good. I expect you're good too. So what have Ofcom waded into for people that haven't been following this as close as you have?
Yes, well, I could spend an hour talking about the regulation of the BBC, but I won't. I'll try and condense it to a few sentences. The online law, the BBC have announced that they want to launch some new radio stations. The DAB launch of those stations has to go through a fairly rigorous bit of scrutiny. The BBC kick it off and then Ofcom pick it up and look at it. The online launch, however, could be done far more easily by the BBC. They've got power to do it without the same degree of scrutiny that the DAB launch has. And they were trying to do that for all of these new stations that they said they wanted to launch. They said, we want to put them online fairly quickly.
So this is a station that's a Radio 1 spin-off, a Radio 2 spin-off, making sort of upgrading BBC Dance, and a Radio 3 spin-off as well.
That's right. And they wanted to get the online versions of these stations on air more quickly than the DAB stations can go on, because they've got to go through this quite complex regulatory process. We have felt quite strongly right from the outset that the online launch of these stations could be as damaging for us, in fact, if not more damaging for us than the DAB launch. Online is a very important part of our audience. About 55% of our listening is online. And in fact, more than that in terms of revenue, our revenue share that's being delivered by those online listening hours is probably 60% plus. So it's very important for us that an online launch didn't slip through the net. And we argued quite strongly to Ofcom that this particular online launch needed to be scrutinised as well as the DAB launch. Now, the only way of doing that was to make the case that the online launch would have a material effect on fair and effective competition. That was the test that the BBC were going through internally, and they sort of handed their homework to Ofcom and said, this is what we think this is okay. And we have managed to persuade Ofcom, I don't think it's just us, I mean, anybody who's, lots of people have been talking to Ofcom, managed to persuade Ofcom that actually there may be a risk that this online launch would have a damaging effect on fair and effective competition. And that was the case we made, and Ofcom seemed to have accepted that, and that's the ruling that they've made. And the power that Ofcom have here is they are allowed to step in if they think that there may be an effect on fair and effective competition, and say to the BBC, you need to do a full public interest test for this in the same way that you're doing one for the DAB station. Now, it's not ideal, but that's where we are.
It's quite interesting. A lot of the people that I've spoken to you a lot about this, spoken to Radio Centre, other radio stations, and whilst people were hopeful they might sort of interrupt this process at Ofcom, probably people are quite surprised they actually have. Because Ofcom had instructed the BBC to be more aggressive online. Why do you think they have stepped in? Is it just because you've written a good letter and had a good moan?
I would hope that genuinely it's because we made a compelling case. And I think there is a compelling case to be made. On this particular subject, we argued strongly that there really was an obvious risk that fair and effective competition would be damaged by the online launch of this service. Of course, the BBC have been allowed to launch their Radio 1 additional service and their Radio 3 additional service, so the case wasn't made for those two services, and Radio Centre argued against everything. Obviously, that's what their job is. The case wasn't strong enough for Ofcom to step in on those services, and they can now launch, next week or next month if the BBC choose to launch them. So there must have been something specific about Radio 2 and its effect on not just Boom but on Gold as well, and potentially Greatest Hits Radio, which swayed the argument inside Ofcom in favour of taking some action.
I mean, isn't this all a bit unfair on the BBC? They can never really develop their service. Is everything really frozen in aspic for them? There is an argument that they could reach older audiences with quality radio that is different. They're pushing into some other areas. In a modern world, can we leave them with the stations that they were sort of allocated in 2003? That's over 20 years ago.
Well, I'm going to have no sympathy with that statement whatsoever, Matt. I mean, there's any number of answers to that, but I think the main one is, of course, the BBC should be encouraged to develop new services if those services can be shown to be adding public value in excess of the effect they may have on fair and effective competition. And that is, in fact, the public interest test. Is the public value here greater than the risk that it's going to affect commercial competitors? And on that basis, the BBC ought to be allowed to launch new services if they can prove that there is a case for them. I don't think that is the case here. We've argued very strongly that it isn't the case here. We hope to carry that day when we get round to arguing. We've already argued half the public interest test. We now got to go through the same process again, and we think there is a very strong case that actually not only does this specific service have a damaging effect on fair and effective competition, it also adds little to nothing in terms of adding to public value. It is not doing anything that the commercial sector isn't already doing. And the BBC is not there to directly compete with the commercial sector. It is there to do different things. It doesn't necessarily only have to deal with market failure, but it is there to do something different. And that's part of the charter. And that's really why the bar is set so high. It's public funds. They should be used properly.
Jim, do you think Phil's going to win his battle?
Well, I think he's made he's had a very strong lobbying campaign, and he's played his hand very well to get this blocked at this level. The thing that interests me, Phil, is whether these regulations even make sense. All of these things are based around whether it's limited bandwidth on air or limited amount of newspapers in existence. And so you've got this thing where, as you say, most of the regulation is built around DAB streams and things like that. Whereas if I wanted to start an online-only radio station tomorrow, I wouldn't be regulated at all, and yet the BBC, if it tries to do anything, will have the full force of Ofcom down on it, and people like you arguing that they're abusing their position. How do you even square this? In 10 years, aren't we just going to be in a free for all anyway?
Yeah, I think the argument there, Jim, is you could start an online radio station tomorrow. And in order for it to be successful, you'd either need to get people to pay you directly for it via a subscription, or you'd need to take some form of advertising revenue. Because if you didn't do one of those two things, you wouldn't be able to run it for long. The BBC can launch a competitor to you the day after you launched, not run any ads on it, not require any extra subscription, and put you out of business. That can't be a situation that is allowed to be present in a free market economy. That just can't be the case, that a state-backed operator can intervene in the market in that way. That's not to say that the current regulations aren't daft. They clearly are daft, but in this particular case, the fact the BBC has to go through a hurdle, a test, is a valid requirement.
How material is the risk to the business that you took a punt on and have built up into a success?
We could go out of business. We could go out of business if the BBC launched the numbers that the BBC put out for Radio 2 Extra were significant, and our view, and based on our own research and the similar research that the Radio Centre has done, is that actually the numbers that the BBC put out underplay the potential audience size that this radio station could attract. And if it attracts anything like the audience that they've suggested, we could easily go out of business. And that surely can't be right, that a new fledgling service launched to appeal to a demographic that commercial radio has never really appealed to before can be put at risk of going out of business because the BBC has decided it made a strategic error and it wants to fix it.
What about, so the BBC own UK TV. They run a load of very successful TV channels like Dave and Gold. If that operation decided to launch an oldies radio station, and kind of took a pump with their own money and ran ads, would you have issues with that one?
I think that's a much more interesting question, one to which I don't have a ready answer. We've already seen huge competition come our way from Greatest Hits Radio. I mean, they were already there when we launched, but they've become much bigger. They've attracted talent of obviously Simon and Ken. They bought radio stations and folded them into their network. But that's in our view, that's fair and effective competition. That's another commercial operator putting their money at risk to try and do something, and we need to be able to respond to that. Could the BBC through that vehicle do the same? I suppose they could, and we would have to deal with that. But we'd be dealing with something that's on a level playing field. Our own research said the number one reason people would choose to listen to a Radio 2 Extra service rather than us was the absence of advertising. That's something you just can't get round, and that's a unique thing that the BBC has at their disposal, alongside, of course, the massive promotional potential of being able to promote this on Radio 2 ad nauseum, which, of course, is what they were going to do and what they may still do if they get the final go-ahead in 6-9 months' time or whatever this eventually plays out.
Well, it's something we'll be following on the show. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And we'll be back with more media news after this. Welcome back. Karin and Jim are here for some more media news. Let's return to last week's election coverage. If you haven't caught up with our special behind the scenes at the BBC and Times Radio, do check it out on your podcast feed or on YouTube. Karin, a big night for the BBC, but Channel 4's coverage made a big impact.
Yeah, they came on strong. A lot of viewership for Channel 4, significantly up from the previous election, which is great. I like to see a diversity. I even thought ITV did pretty well. I thought there was really good spread across the broadcast channels. There were, in my election coverage watching, I actually wound up switching back and forth, whereas normally I'm very loyal to the BBC. So interesting. I think they had an interesting mix. I think, was it Channel 4 that had Nadine Dorries on?
Yes.
So I think, you can always talk about what makes for informed television, but she certainly is good television. And she mixed it up. They mixed it up very entertainingly on some of the panels that she had. So I personally wouldn't have necessarily picked her, but I think it paid off for them in terms of generating conflict in an interesting way, perhaps.
How did you watch the election?
I had BBC on the big screen because the BBC wouldn't allow their feed to be put into the other thing I had, which was 4 other channels on a laptop in front of me, flicking between them. So about 5 channels plus Twitter. That's good. On in the background, which meant that as soon as I could see anything bizarre happening, GB News, right, turn the volume on that one. Yeah. Oh, there's a bloke, there's a former darts champion playing darts at a pub. Great. Well, that's different. We'll go back to Channel 4 for a bit.
I think we, for Media Podcast next election, we need to have all the channels channels on, and basically in the same way they interrupt to go to a constituency camp, we go, oh, we need to just stop you there. Let's go.
Let's go. Dancing dog.
Yes, Jimmy News. I think that's the way to watch it.
I mean, Channel 4 did improve, but I mean, if anyone watched their 2019 election night, it was probably the single worst bit of broadcasting that had ever been put out by them. It was complete chaos and almost contributed to the channel getting privatised. So that was when they were still sort of trying to do a comedy twist on it.
Yes.
And this time they basically became, podcasts on TV.
Yeah, it was kind of commentariat.
Yeah.
But it was that whole ecosystem of the rest is politics news agents. Right. Well, that's where our audience is. Let's just put them on telly. And I haven't seen the breakdown of their ratings, but I assume it was weighted towards that couple of hours when the exit polls come in, but there's no results yet. And the BBC is busy going around, and it was trying to make a thing about who's going to declare first. Whereas you could just switch onto Channel 4 and watch Nadine having it out with everyone, which worked for a couple of hours. I wouldn't have wanted that through the night, but that did work for the first couple of hours. And also, a really boring thing, but their scheduling trick was Channel 4 just went live a bit earlier, which was quite neat. So, you could start watching. They probably hooked an extra 50, 100,000 viewers that way.
I mean, Karin, it's a pretty good election for podcasters. I mean, news and politics podcasts pretty much dominated the top of the charts. Are they going to see a bit of a fall now? They've lost the momentum of declining Conservative Party, or has it got a load of new listeners in?
I think both. I think, you have to expect there's going to be a fall just because the impetus of an election gives urgency to listening to the news podcasts. But there's been a steady increase in listenership to news and politics podcasts over the past couple of years. And there's been some really kind of compelling new entrants into the marketplace over the past few years. So I would be surprised if it fell back completely. I think some of those new listeners will stick around. But yeah, it's not going to be, you can't have election level volumes of listening all year round.
Well, Podmasters, who do a few kind of politics podcasts, revealed subscribers up between 5 and 10% across June. Jim, pretty successful for the press. News and politics page views doing very well, according to the Press Gazette. I guess you'd expect that.
You would expect that. I get the feeling that places were quite happy if they were sort of standing still or improving slightly on 2019. The extent to which the changes in Google and Facebook have completely upended the market for really clickable stories. How
does that change how the election's covered?
Well, I think actually what's happened is a lot of that stuff is just reaching people directly, whereas previously, I used to work at BuzzFeed, and stuff that 10 years ago I'd have written up as a post, which would then have gone viral on Facebook. The intermediary just isn't necessary anymore. The original clip is going to go around your friends' WhatsApp groups. The original out of context hilarious screen grab is going to be all over your TikTok feed anyway. So I think what's happening is on the sort of lower grade stuff, it's going viral anyway, but without the need for sort of a news site in the middle. But then you see the impact. I mean, watching the page views when, for instance, Pippa Crerar at The Guardian broke the story about the first story of what turned out to be many about gambling, when a Conservative MP was turned out to have been placing bets on the election day. To watch that graph just shoot up as people rushed, and they were clearly sharing the link around and audience was coming in. I am always reassured that good stuff that's interesting will still get read.
Does it mean, because obviously people talk a lot about making sure your own home page is strong, and for politics and the election, lots of live pages. I mean, are the newspapers doing a better job of creating those as destinations, and people kind of keep that open in a tab?
I'm one of the great things about working at The Guardian is we still have people who come directly to us, and actually amazingly few places have that when you really look at the stats. There's BBC obviously way out in front in terms of raw numbers. Us, Sky News, Mail Online are really the quad who have that core audience, and then you've got the paywalled ones that have their loyal audience, FT, Telegraph, Times, who are read intensely but not in terms of raw numbers by the highest amount. And that that's a fascinating thing, because a lot of the rest of the outlets are kind of have nominally large readerships but don't really have a sort of loyalty that so they're not really shaping someone's understanding of the news. They might just be picking up traffic from whatever is driving by at that moment in time. And you saw this, some of the research we did during the election was fascinating. The amount that people relied on Apple News, or and would trust whatever was in it, and they didn't even necessarily know which outlet it was from, but they're like, oh well, Apple's put it on my phone, it must be
true.
Right. Yeah.
Karin, how is your social usage? Still big on Twitter, or have you getting a load from TikTok or Instagram or anywhere else?
Well, I'm still big on Twitter. I'm still very fond of Twitter, which I will never call X, and still resistant to TikTok, but I'm unusual in that I think that's not where the trajectory of travel is. But I think it's what I'm really impressed by this election is, as you were alluding to, just the quality of traditional journalism and the good work that was done. I also think that this turned out to be a very telegenic campaign from the beginning. I enjoyed it enormously as content. Everything from Rishi Sunak standing out in the rain for no apparent reason to the video of D-Day with him not being there, to the quality journalism like Pippa Crerar work that you cited. It was really interesting for me. I was actually in Cannes for the Creativity Festival, so not really paying attention to British news for a few days, and then in the airport on the way back, I was finding all this stuff about Gamblingate, and I was like, what the hell has happened? It was entertaining right to the end.
Plus a bit of Ed Davey too.
Yeah, and isn't it funny? You're saying it's a very TV election, and yet the ratings weren't great. So you've got this weird thing where what's actually driving people's understanding of the election? It's video clips of politicians, largely created by television broadcasters for evening broadcasts who've got access because of those broadcast slots. But the actual audience for it and the political damage or political benefit is coming from it sort of seeping into people's feeds in a way that can't be monetized. So you've got this odd thing that the infrastructure that creates the moments is increasingly separated from where the audience is seeing it.
But also, as you pointed out, the Liberal Democrats understood that very well in the decision to have Ed Davey fall off of things as background for a conversation about policy. I think it just worked.
They were right. It kept them in the conversation. Whether the conversation they had said much about their policies, but it didn't mean he was in the news every day. Yeah. Also, it touched on the point you said earlier about the Telegraph, a newspaper versus being an online platform. If you are an established broadcaster or media operator, you are inexplicably wedded to your original medium, whereas your audience has probably moved on. Just before the quiz, that merger between Paramount and Skydance, well, it's back on. Sunday saw Paramount's board approve the merger, which is valued at $8 billion. Karin, Paramount have been left behind in the streaming wars. Does Skydance offer them anything new, or even just some new people to have another go?
I mean, hopefully so. Obviously it's a big merger, it's a big change. It's kind of nice to see Paramount back in the news, because I remember the days back of watching Paramount TV in the States, and they were the home of Star Trek. So my nerdy heart is glad of it. But Skydance has an enormous amount of both content and personnel that they will bring to the equation. I think my hesitation is not about the quality of either of these two media enterprises. I think there's a lot of potential in them, but just re-entering the streaming wars at this moment in time, when there's already so much entrenched, so many entrenched players kind of for people to choose from, and where even the Netflixes of the world are now struggling to acquire new viewers. I'm slightly skeptical about how much audience is still available to them, but with good content, all things are possible.
Jim, is this part one of a roll-up? Do you think they have to merge with someone else, combine with a bigger entity, do something different?
You know what? Hollywood and that end of things is so outside my comfort zone. I'm so much used to sort of the tiny little British media roll-up stories where it's like someone's paid sort of 10 million for someone. But when you look at this, I think there was one stat that really struck me, which was that the movie studio Paramount, it's Paramount with that made something like $300 million last year, whereas their TV operations were in the billions. And that's the sort of strange thing that you've got, is that you've got the brand one, Paramount can't die. Well, I don't know, mate, those figures aren't, much more than many mid-sized European businesses when on a sort of segment by segment basis. Sometimes I feel that looking at the numbers can blind you to just putting a finger to the wind and seeing which way things are blowing, because you can just tell that, for instance, their streaming product isn't working. You could, you can look at that. They added 5%. It's just clearly not going to be big enough to survive in the long term. And so that leads you to one inevitable conclusion.
Well, we will see. Time for the media quiz. This week we're playing Polish the Turd. There's been a number of new commissions announced this week, which sound absolutely awful. I'll give you the best possible bits from the press release. You tell me what the reality is. Buzz in with your names if you know the answer. So Karin, you'll say...
Karin.
And Jim will say...
Jim.
Let's play Polish That Turd. Producer Matt Hill's done this, so I just want to opt out of any commitments.
That's
right?
okay.
Question number 1. The everyday story of Somerset folk is fun to film, but maybe a bit more Fawlty Towers than Downton Abbey.
Karen.
Yes.
Is that the Jacob Rees-Mogg reality show?
It is. It's the new Fly on the Wall documentary from Discovery Plus. Meet the Rees-Moggs.
God help us.
Do people want that?
Nobody
half the lobby will watch it. That feels like the sort of thing that sounded funny in the ideas meeting, and I'm not entirely sure who's going to tune in for that.
I think it would be sort of interesting if he was all over the place while still trying to be a minister.
Messy Rees-Mogg, sort of like.
Yeah.
I just don't think this is a kid who was pictured holding the FT age 12 in a national newspaper. I mean, he's going to be.
I think much more fun to like send him on travels around the world or something. Pair him up with somebody.
Yeah, I don't know. I have such an issue with Jacob Rees-Mogg's existence in our culture, just purely from the perspective of he has 6 children and has never changed a nappy. I think that should preclude him from public conversation.
From existence. Okay, what's this? Question number 2. Show City represents a unique opportunity for fans to immerse themselves in the worlds of their favourite shows like never before.
Karen?
Yes.
Is that the gaming metaverse versions of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here and Love Island?
Yes. ITV Studios are putting those into a reality TV virtual world called Show City. Jim,
Hang on. This is like everything in about 2005 that had a presence in Second Life?
Yeah.
And there was like this run of stories. Everyone went, oh, this thing is entering the online world of Second Life. I feel like I'm going crazy. This happens every 10 years, and everyone goes, no, you're all right, mate. I'll just get on with what everyone's doing.
It's like bell-bottom jeans. Somebody's determined to make them a thing in every generation.
Will you be wearing your Facebook Metaverse helmet to immerse yourself in a virtual Love Island?
I will not.
Good. Right. Question number 3. A new TV ad claiming that a better way for our waterways is already underway.
You know this one?
Karen?
Better way for our waterways is...
It's a new TV ad.
I definitely didn't click the links.
Who do you think...
See, I thought I'd do this legitimately. You can edit this out.
I don't know what you're saying.
What are you suggesting?
Which company did a new TV ad claiming that a better way for our waterways is already underway?
Is it Thames Water?
It's the other one.
Is it Yorkshire Water?
It's Wessex Water.
The other one? There are many water companies. Are we now a utilities podcast? Can we do that instead?
Water. You just made that up.
So Wessex Water, whose advert has been banned by the ASA because it admitted key information about its record on sewage pollution, as close to polishing a turd as we're likely to get to in this quiz.
This is the sort of earned media they wanted when they set out to do this.
And they have been successful. Well done.
We are talking about them, and we wouldn't have been without their ad campaign.
Well, yes. Congratulations, Karin. You won the quiz. You can help Wessex Water with their new creatives for the next year and come back to us with your ideas. Thank you to both for joining us on the show today. Jim, how can people keep up with your good work?
I reluctantly, during the election campaign, rejoined Twitter, so I'm still hanging around at Jim Waterson.
And Karin?
I am also still clinging on by my fingernails on Twitter and currently in the process of shopping my novel, so if any agents are listening. Last time I was on the show, by the way, an agent did get in touch, so it's not a complete waste of time.
See, if you are listening, you should put adverts on the Media Podcast. It really does work. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And that's it for today. Remember, there's 25% off your first booking at the London Podcast Studios, where we record our show every week. When you use the code MEDIAPOD, that is, just head to thelondonpodcaststudios.com, use the code MEDIAPOD and get 25% off. And if you're new to the show, remember to hit follow on your podcast app of choice or on YouTube, so you can get every new episode. My name is Matt Deegan. The producer was Matt Hill. It was a Rethink Audio production. We'll see you next week.